Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please help me welcome to the stage Bret Stephens.
Well, good morning. I should just mention at the beginning that I'm told there will be time for Q&A, but that it depends on your asking succinct questions that end in question marks, and which I can then repeat for the benefit of the filming of this production. Can someone close the door? Thank you. The title of my remarks this morning is Notes on the Passing of Liberal Culture. And there's a story that might be apocryphal but is too good not to share, which is told about Mahatma Gandhi. Hi, Jamie. All right, I'm going to begin again for Jamie's benefit. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but too good not to share, which is told about Mahatma Gandhi. The Indian independence leader was asked by a journalist, "What do you think of Western civilization?" Gandhi thought for a moment and replied, "I think it would be a good idea." I've been pondering that line for the better part of a year as I consider the state of liberal culture, both in the United States and throughout the world. What do I think of liberalism? I think it would be a good idea. In fact, it could be our salvation as a country and as a civilization if only we can remember what it's all supposed to be about. Let's review some recent events in the news. First event, President Trump seeks to suppress the publication of a book he finds personally insulting and politically embarrassing, and then proposes toughening U.S. libel laws to make it more difficult to publish criticism and make it easier for people in power to sue. Second event, Laura Kipnis, a feminist professor of film studies at Northwestern University, writes an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education warning about sexual paranoia on campus made worse by new enforcement standards for Title IX complaints. For using her First Amendment rights to complain about Title IX, she is repeatedly sued under Title IX by students who argued that her opinions created a, quote, chilling environment on campus from which they are entitled to protection. Third item. At an Alabama rally, Donald Trump offers the following view of football players who take a knee during the singing of the national anthem. And I quote, "Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, 'Get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired, he's fired'?" Fourth item, Roger Pielke Jr., a respected expert in disaster trends at the University of Colorado, is investigated by a Democratic member of Congress because some of his research contradicts the more dire scenarios painted by climate change activists. Now, as you've probably noticed, I have drawn these examples from both the political left and the political right. You can probably tell, too, that this is just a sample of what could have been a very long list. They are all instances of an assault on liberalism that has been coming for a long time and which has slowly but surely moved from the fringes of our politics to the center of it. Just to be clear, I am not talking about liberalism in the contemporary American sense of the term, as in Barbara Boxer and Elizabeth Warren are liberals, Ted Cruz and Nikki Haley are conservatives, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is a hermaphrodite. What I mean by liberal comes from the Latin root liber, meaning free. To be a liberal, very simply, is to believe in freedom. Liberalism, the ism, is the belief that the aim of politics is to maximize personal freedom, constrained only by the respect for the freedom of others and the safety of society as a whole. The transcendent phrase, the pursuit of happiness, expresses the central liberal idea best. It holds that the course and content of the good life cannot be imposed from above, from parents, priests, teachers, gurus, village elders, kings, or supreme leaders. It is fully universal and yet deeply personal. It requires a sense of social tolerance as well as a concept of personal responsibility. It involves trial and error. It implies the possibility of free will. Above all, it is something that every individual must choose for himself or herself alone, no matter whether the choice leads to success and happiness or to failure and grief. We have had 242 years to get used to the words, the pursuit of happiness. But it's worth pausing to reflect on what an extraordinary idea it really is. The fundamental conviction of ancient philosophers was that the primary purpose of politics was not to make men free. It was to habituate them to virtue. Freedom, the Stoics taught, is nothing more than being a dog chained to a cart. We cannot choose where the cart, that is, compulsion, circumstance, or fate, will take us, but we can choose whether to be dragged by the chain or walk willingly behind it. But modern philosophers, beginning with those great Britons John Locke and John Stuart Mill and the immortal Scot Adam Smith, and stretching to more contemporary philosophers like those wonderful Austrians Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek, believed that the good society could not be based on a concept of virtue, as enticing as that may seem. On the contrary, they knew that virtue-centric societies, from Sparta in ancient Greece to the medieval monasteries of Europe to 20th century communism and fascism, were almost invariably despotic societies, which crushed humanity under an oppressive and forgiving concept of, quote, the good. Societies based on freedom might aim for less lofty aims and allow for a great deal of sinfulness. But in creating space for what Mill memorably called experiments in living, they allowed the human spirit to breathe and to flourish. I cannot emphasize enough that if freedom is to be at all meaningful, it must allow for an extraordinary amount of failure, futility, stupidity, and ugliness. We start businesses that, more often than not, fail. We enter marriages that, half the time, end in divorce. We experiment with drugs and indulge in drink, and some of us end up as addicts and wrecks. We blow our money on slot machines. We traffic in crazy conspiracies and express shocking bigotries and tell shameless lies. And that's just if you're the president. Adam Smith said, "There's a lot of ruin in a nation. There's a lot of ruin in our personal lives as well, all because we have dedicated ourselves to this proposition about the pursuit of happiness." Now, it is normal in most liberal societies to make compromises with our own freedoms. In the United States, we criminalize drug use most of the time and sex work, except in Nevada, and we have largely banned smoking in public spaces. In Europe and Canada, there are laws against so-called hate speech. Welfare states put the interests of redistribution ahead of those of profit-making or of equality ahead of individual merit and excellence and achievement. There isn't really a right answer as to what the right amount of social protection versus individual autonomy ought to be. What matters is what kind of accommodations and trade-offs different societies are prepared to make at different points in their evolution. Nevertheless, there is a point at which liberal democracies can transform themselves through the slow and steady accretion of protective measures into something like a padded cell. That is, they can so cushion themselves from the possibility of harm and error and insult and offense that they become a form of prison. From societies based on the ideal of the pursuit of happiness, we can quietly slip into systems based on the prevention of unhappiness, of ugliness and hurt. And I fear this is where we may be headed, toward a soft tyranny of the nice, the well-meaning, and the politically correct. If you followed some of the news from academia in recent years, you will probably have noticed that that is where the academy is leading us. This is a world of visiting conservative speakers being shouted down and assaulted, of professors living in fear of accidentally offending their students with so-called microaggressions, of fury at something called cultural appropriation, an example of which was the wearing of ponchos and sombreros at a Mexican-themed Halloween party, of a process of salving the feelings of students bought at the price of their permanent infantilization. Let me give you an example. In the fall of 2014, a student at Brown University got wind that her school was going to host a debate between two women, one a feminist and the other a libertarian, which also makes her a feminist, on the subject of campus sexual assault. The student feared that exposure to such a debate could be damaging to people in the audience, some of whom might find their experiences of sexual assault, and I quote, invalidated by what the debaters might say. So the student organized a safe space. As described by the essayist Judith Shulevitz in the New York Times, an excellent newspaper, by the way, the space was a room, quote, equipped with cookies, coloring books, bubbles, Play-Doh. This is in college, mind you. Calming music, pillows, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies, as well as students and staff members trained to deal with trauma. Now that sounds harmless enough, but the story of safe spaces doesn't end there. As Shulevitz noted in her essay, once you designate some spaces as safe, you imply that the rest are unsafe. It follows that they should be made safer. That's an important insight. It shows how easily an impulse to shield and protect the vulnerable quickly becomes a desire, and then a demand, to impose a particular concept of safety on others, whether they want it or not. After all, if a college or university should accept the principle of a safe space in a single designated room, why should that same principle not extend to the classroom, the lecture hall, dormitories, college newspapers, chat rooms, social media, and so on? If one wants to accommodate the sensitivities of some students, shouldn't that accommodation extend not only to what one says around them, but also to what one says anywhere, or what one allows to be said anywhere? And if it is not okay to say certain things anywhere, should we even think them? Wouldn't we be better off if the ideas that can hurt people's feelings or trigger their anxieties never popped into our heads in the first place? Not long ago, I heard the English novelist Salman Rushdie, who knows a thing or two about what real safe spaces are about, and what sorts of real micro or macroaggressions require those safe spaces, to remark that instead of making colleges safe spaces for thought, we are moving toward a world in which campuses are becoming safe spaces from thought. In short, we are witnessing the slow motion disintegration of what used to be called liberal education. That is, an education in open-mindedness, of intellectual challenge, of the freedom to express unpopular thoughts. In a recent survey conducted by a scholar at the Brookings Institution, a plurality of college students today, that is fully 44%, do not believe the First Amendment to the United States Constitution protects so-called hate speech, when, of course, it absolutely does. More shockingly, a narrow majority of students, 51%, think it is, quote, acceptable for a student group to shout down a speaker with whom they disagree. And an astonishing 19%, that is almost 1 in 5, also agree that it is acceptable to use violence to prevent a speaker from speaking. All of this is happening among students who, if you ask them to describe themselves politically, would overwhelmingly call themselves liberals or progressives. That tells us something about how far removed contemporary ideological liberalism has become from its etymological forebear. A more description of these students' attitudes might, in my opinion, be called fascistic. In all events, it represents the substitution of inquiry with ideology, of method with conclusion, of education with indoctrination, and of inquiry with identity. It would be bad enough if these trends were confined mainly to the college quad. I'm afraid they are not. Thanks to the relentless stress on the politics of identity, we have entered a world in which what seems to matter most in many of our political debates isn't the logic or force of one's arguments, it's the racial, ethnic, or sexual standing of the person making the argument. This is the Baroque way in which we speak these days. As a woman, I think X. As a gay man, I believe Y. As a privileged person, I apologize for Z. This is dangerous. Lincoln warned in the Young Men's Lyceum address when he was 29 years old that, and I quote, reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. But identity politics is the politics of anti-reason, of passion and self-assertion over thoughtfulness and common humanity. It adds another layer of faction and an element of division in our already hyperpolarized, siloed, and splintered civic, and I might add, digital life. It creates an artificial barrier to mutual understanding and makes the distance between making an argument and causing personal offense terrifyingly short. Now let me turn to the political right. One of the worst aspects of identity politics is that it is a game at which two can play. For many years, I thought identity politics was mainly a fixation of the left, of academia. But the rise of the so-called alt-right and the election of Donald Trump has taught me, and it's perhaps taught many of us, that white identity politics remains a powerful driving force in American politics. We saw it in the widespread birtherism that Trump so infamously championed a few years ago. We saw it at Charlottesville and in the president's unforgivable equivocations when it came to condemning neo-Nazis. We saw it again in the president's comments about people from S-hole countries as opposed to those delightfully pale-faced Norwegians like my friend Karl Rove. And Johan in the front row, who's very delightful, but a little red in the face. We've seen it in the nonstop demagoguery by the administration and its supporters about crimes and murders committed by illegal immigrants, when, in actual fact, illegal immigrants are incarcerated at about half the rate of native-born Americans. Not surprisingly, the adoption of white identity politics by the president fits with a broader pattern of illiberal thinking coming from the White House and its allies. Donald Trump has, like no American president in living memory, painted a political target on the news media and called us, an enemy of the people, a sentiment that seems to be shared by the likes of Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and our good friend in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and other tyrants we typically consider ourselves superior to. He has devalued the coin of truth when it comes to presidential statements, replacing straightforward factual honesty with what one might call narrative truth, a term that once belonged to the realm of psychoanalysis, if not, in fact, to the realm of psychosis. Consider this exchange that the president had about a year ago, just after he came to office, with Bill O'Reilly, when O'Reilly was still at Fox News. O'Reilly asks, and I quote, "Is there any validity to the criticism of you that you say things that you can't back up factually, and as the president you say there are 3 million illegal aliens who voted and you don't have the data to back that up? Some people are going to say it's irresponsible for the president to say that." I think O'Reilly's violence to the English language is on a par with violence to other things, but anyway. to which the president replies, "Many people have come out and said that I'm right. Now, many people say the moon landings were a hoax. Many people say that Jim Morrison faked his own death. Many people say Ishtar was the greatest film of the 20th century. Many people say is what is known as an argumentum ad populum, the logical fallacy that holds that if many people believe so, it is so. The president is responding to a claim of fact, not by denying the fact, but by denying the claim that facts are supposed to have on an argument. He isn't telling O'Reilly that he's got his facts wrong. He's saying that as far as he is concerned, facts, as most people understand them, don't matter, that they are indistinguishable from and interchangeable with opinion, and that statements of fact needn't have any purchase against a man who is either sufficiently powerful to ignore them or sufficiently shameless to deny them, or in his case, both. This is, of course, yet another example of our new illiberalism. If some people on the left think they can assert truth claims based on their status as victims, Trump is asserting his own truth claims based on his status as being powerful. Truth is what he thinks he can get away with. If he needs to say that 90% of the apartments in one of his towers are sold, when in fact only 20% are, that's truth. If he needs to say that the size of his inaugural crowd was larger than Obama's, that's true as well. It would be bad enough if I were speaking of the President of the United States alone, but his political rise also meant the rise of his many helpers, from alternative facts Kellyanne Conway to zero facts Sean Hannity. The conservative movement, which used to rail against the pernicious idea that the truth is relative, and it is a pernicious idea, now seems to find complete comfort with a president for whom the relativeness of truth is as important to him as his hair. When the truth, and is thin I might add, when the truth becomes relative to those in power, liberalism is in danger. For free societies to flourish, they need to be able to rely on a common notion of truth, a common base of facts, and a commonly agreed set of rules about how we distinguish truth from lies, facts from falsehood. The alternative is truth as a function of power, a world in which those who wield power get to decide what is true, and those who lack power have no basis on which to challenge them. If you need a sense of where such politics can lead, I'd suggest you pick up a copy of George Orwell's 1984. Let me sum up. Liberalism is a political concept whose core value is individual freedom. Within the family of liberalism, we can have legitimate differences over whether to prioritize economic freedom or moral freedom, or how the balance of civil liberties, or how to balance civil liberties against collective security. That's what liberals and conservatives have been arguing about from time immemorial without doing fundamental damage to the overall fabric of our liberties. Now, however, liberalism is under attack from at least two quarters. On the left, by the coddlers, on the right, by the tramplers. The coddlers want to protect people from the consequences of freedom, from everything from secondhand smoke to politically incorrect speech. They want to exalt a concept of identity that can serve as a barrier to intellectual challenge the way a moated castle is a defense from slings and arrows. And they want to impose a concept of virtue that, much as we may sympathize with its intentions, opposition to racism or sexism, for instance, must inevitably have the result of squelching free speech and smothering independent thought. When the word skepticism becomes a dirty one on the political left, as it has with certain current environmental orthodoxies, you know that something is amiss. As for the tramplers, they have their own version of identity politics, namely the identity of the white majority. But they are less interested in the freedoms that most need protecting in a democratic society, the rights of the political minority and the liberties of the individual citizen. America has previously thrived as a nation because we have a cultural disposition in favor of the gadfly, the contrarian, the upstart, the entrepreneur, the late bloomer, the disruptor, the activist, the social nuisance, the New York Times columnist. But that is at risk whenever personal dissent is treated as an affront to patriotism. I personally do not have too much sympathy for some of the political views of Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback who was the first to take a knee during the singing of the national anthem. I would never do anything except stand for the American flag with my hand on my heart. But when the President of the United States calls him a son of a bitch and urges that he be fired, then I'm going to take a stand with Kaepernick. That is, I'm going to stand with the claims of individual conviction and conscience, however much I may disagree with those convictions, against the threats of the powerful. That's what America is about. To think otherwise is very simply un-American. So there it is. How do we defend liberalism against the coddlers and the tramplers? That's another speech, but it begins by reminding ourselves and teaching others what liberalism is, how extraordinary it is, how vulnerable it is, and why it is so worth preserving. When are we going to start teaching civics seriously again in high school? When are we going to again require college students to take classes in Western and American political thought? When will we again understand our founders as something more than just slaveholders and sexists and hypocrites, which some of them, of course, surely were, but more importantly, as people of their time who nonetheless transcended their time with ideas that have gradually emancipated us all? When are we going to insist that an American president should set an example of personal probity and truthfulness and deep respect for the institutions that sustain our liberalism, beginning with a free and vigorous and sometimes rude, intemperate, and biased press? When are we going to drop the cop-out and the crutch of identity politics and tell ourselves, white or black, gay or straight, male or female, that above all, we are Americans? And when will we understand again that what makes America America isn't geography or nationality, much less ancestry? It is a universal creed that holds whether we were born in Haiti or in Norway, descended from the Mayflower, or, as in my case, from the shtetl, that we are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. This is the challenge of our time, and I hope that we are equal to it. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll take some questions. Okay. So, Helene.
Because I've been studying this situation in the colleges. I'm studying this situation in the colleges, and I understand a lot of this has to do with the fact that I'm not sure if it's 80 or 90%, so I'm not going to pull a Trumpism, but a huge percentage of them are on the left, the professors, and they also have a say in new professors. They get to vote on new professors. So if you're going to end up with 100% professors on the left, what do you think you're going to get?
Helene raises, let me just repeat the question. She makes the point that among the American professoriate, it is overwhelmingly on the political left. It moves somewhere from the Clinton left to the Sanders left to the Sandinista left. Then we're getting to the center of academia, over to the Venezuelan left, and finally we end with Stalinism. And that's exactly it, in that universities have allowed themselves to be captured ideologically in a way that is deeply damaging to the fundamental interests of a liberal education. It is astonishing that someone like Ben Shapiro, who's a never-Trumper, would need tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of security to speak at what is allegedly, but not actually, the premier public institution in the state of California. That is a stunning comment on what Berkeley has allowed itself to become, that someone like Shapiro, of all people, would be considered practically persona non grata. It is an astonishing fact that when Charles Murray visited Middlebury College, he and the very nice Democrat, centrist Democrat who sponsored his talk or invited him, moderated his talk, were physically assaulted. A female professor had a concussion and spent a week in a dark room by being physically assaulted by students who, God forbid, should have to countenance the presence of Charles Murray on their campuses. No scholar has made a more interesting case for why Donald Trump won than Charles Murray, who anticipated why Donald Trump won than Charles Murray. He's worth listening to. And by the way, I should add, it is also worth listening to the bigots and the ideologues, not because we agree with them, but because we cannot intelligently disagree until we have thoroughly understood. To disagree well, you must first understand well. And the best thing college campuses, people like Janet Napolitano, who now runs the UC system, and so on, can do is, number one, provide a stalwart defense for free speech on campus, and number two, don't treat conservative professors the way anthropologists might treat certain tribes in the Amazons as kind of an interesting curiosity, but rather as part of the mainstream of American life with profoundly important things to say about every single field of scholarship. So thank you for the question. Ma'am.
In physics, for every action, there's a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where we are. It got so extreme with the action of these horrible white males that are deplorable, they're terrible. I remember Mitt Romney, who's fairly moderate, arguing that we built this. I worked on a manufacturing floor with a lot of people. They felt they were insulted because they did build it. You know, they have worked very hard. And so you had
The question.
extreme reaction. But don't you think that's where we are?
Right.
To get to the middle, don't you have to have that kind of thing?
Well, you know, I've never been a Marxist. Oh, excuse me. So the question, the lady makes a point that, let me see if I'm paraphrasing this correctly, that what we are dealing with is action and reaction, thesis and antithesis, that extremism on the one side begat or has begotten extremism on the other. I don't think, and as I was beginning to formulate an answer, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a Hegelian. I don't, in fact, think that history moves through a series of contradictions being resolved. I think we're actually we're capable, or we ought to be capable, of being intelligent critics of a particular position. I don't think anyone... If you have followed my career at the Wall Street Journal, you know that I had plenty of less than charitable things to say about the administration of Barack Obama. So those of you who are upset that I'm giving it to Donald Trump, I give it to everyone. But But that doesn't mean that intelligent people can't simply get beyond the desire to do the opposite. You know, there's a wonderful scene in Seinfeld, which is my guide to deep thinking, in which you know, George Costanza, the Schlumpy character, and Jerry are having breakfast at Tom's restaurant. And Costanza says, you know, every decision I make is wrong. You know, every time I order, you know, a turkey and Swiss, I wish I'd gotten the ham and cheese, and it's just, and Jerry's answer is, well, if you just do the opposite of what you think you're going to do, the opposite must necessarily be right. And as it plays out in that episode, he says, you know, you're right. That's what I'm going to do. So he spots this beautiful woman at the counter. He walks up to her. He says, hello, I'm George. I'm unemployed and I live with my mother. And she looks at him and she says, oh, hello, you know. But in real life, you can modulate, okay? And by the way, I would say this, and I said this yesterday, I would say this to all of you in this room who are Democrats or in some ways aghast by this administration. This country does not need a resistance. This country needs an opposition. This country doesn't need insanity on a bipartisan basis. The answer to MAGA is massa, make America sane again. And that's what, if Democrats want to win, then they are going to have to find some way of responding to Donald Trump that is modulated and that is not something like Edward Munch's primal scream going full blast 24 hours a day. Sir, in the middle.
Where do you draw the line, if you do draw the line, between a person's right to demonstrate against racism and an employer's right to control politics within his workplace, whether it's a football stadium or an office premises?
Where do I draw the line? So repeat it, between a person's right to demonstrate against racism and for instance, the ownership rights of owners who want to set the tone in their cities. Look, that's a very legitimate question, right? That's a genuine dilemma that we have, that football players are, at the end of the day, not just simply free and public persons. They're employees in an organization that often owns these stadiums, and your free speech rights are always going to be limited in certain public settings. But to the extent that is possible, you know, for instance, private universities do not have to observe constitutional niceties when it comes to campus tribunals. For instance, those dealing with sexual abuse and assault. You don't have a right, if you're accused of a sexual assault as a student, to face your accuser, for instance. You don't have those 4th, 5th, 6th Constitutional Amendment rights. But large institutions like national football, like American universities, should do what they can to model themselves, because they model themselves on our common sense of what we have a right to do in public places. I think because it's an education, and because football isn't simply a closed shop in which only those who are paying get to watch. So, does an owner have a right to fire Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee? Yes. Is it wise to do so? No. And I think we have elided this distinction between what we have a right to do and what we ought to do from a sense of wisdom and respect for the overall ideals of the country. Sir.
Where do you take issue with Ben Shapiro, or are you in sync with much of what he said?
Well, I'm pro-choice. He's not. That's fine. It's a free country. The question is, where do I take issue with Ben Shapiro, and where do I not? we're different people. I mean, in some respects, I agree with him on some things. In many respects, I don't. I've always been very much a kind of a social libertarian or liberal in my thinking. But that's really neither here nor there. I mean, Ben Shapiro is a guy with this and that political view, with a fairly broad following, who's interesting and is, you know, certainly a dynamic speaker, and who's interesting for college Republicans or college audiences. And it is insane that someone like him, who is by no means an extremist, should be treated as one. All it does is demonstrate that the real extremists are the people who find Ben Shapiro extreme. Yes?
I think it might help some of the people in the audience, as I was just asked, if you would explain what a shuttle is. A lot of people don't know what it is.
Oh, okay, just to be clear, when listening to you, we have to be clear that there are two homonyms, shtetl, not to be confused with S-hole, although the shtetls were S-holes, and the shtetls were the communities on the so-called Pale of Settlement in places like what used to be called Bessarabia or Ukraine, Poland, all of these forgotten places, Galicia and so on, that now are Belarus and Lithuania and Moldova and Romania and so on, that were the indigent, desperately indigent places where Jews had been forced to live by the Russian Empire. And when my great-grandfather arrived with his 8 children and his wife from Bessarabia, he had no skills, no English, and probably not the best hygiene. And if you look at the literature of the early 20th century, talking about Henry Adams talked about that weird Yiddish, right? You would be hearing commentary that is not so different from some of the comments that are today made about the Haitians and the Nigerians and the Latin Americans. We were poor, broken, I say this as a Jew, poor, broken, and filthy once too. And yet let me name you some of the sons of people who arrived from the shtetl. Mike Bloomberg, his father arrived from the shtetl. Jonas Salk, his parents arrived from the shtetl. You can go through a list of some of the greatest American benefactors, philanthropic, businessmen, scientists, and so on, and they all came from those S-hole shtetls and made the American dream their own. And I think this is so fundamental to what we are as Americans. We don't arrive with PhDs. We're not... With a handful of honorable exceptions, we are not dashing Norwegians. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you feel that people, the result of the election, weren't that people admired Donald Trump? It's just that it was a terrible response to what we had had and what we see in our universities as a we don't love America anymore situation.
Look, there is no question that the question was similar to one asked earlier. Wasn't Donald Trump and his election not so much a vote affirming Trump's values or personality, but a reaction to the suffocating illiberalism, political correctness, media bias, and so on that had prevailed in the 8 preceding years? And I think that there's a great deal of truth to that. But just because you have complaints about the past 8 years doesn't mean that you ought to be prepared to accept just about anything as a response to it. Look, it's very important, and I say this, I agree with many things that the Trump administration has done. I'm happy the embassy is moving to Jerusalem where it belongs. I think it's a terrific thing. I think it's a terrific thing that Apple is repatriating hundreds of billions of dollars that it had kept in cash overseas because we had insane corporate taxation systems. And when those things happen, I say it, okay? I acknowledge it because I am trying as a columnist to look at the world with an open eye and to accept the facts as they come to me. You know, John Maynard Keynes, whom I otherwise don't entirely love as an economist, said, "When the facts change, so do my opinions. What do you do, sir?" And that is what we ought to do. But we also need to keep sight of the fact that deeper than the matter of policy or of tax policy or the location of our embassies or funding for our military or any number of issues, there is a question of the moral, political, and philosophical culture of the United States. And we are a liberal society. We are a freedom-loving people. And we need two parties, Democrats and Republicans, who honor and exalt that tradition. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that I remain honest myself and do my best to keep both parties honest as well. Thank you very much.